Well, today we're going to launch into a different area of economic analysis altogether. Up until this point, we've been assuming a lot of things about people. In particular, we've made a lot of assumptions about how rational people are. This is sometimes referred to as the assumption of Homo economicus, which is the idea that people are naturally economically minded and that they're going to do things in their own self-interest or things that are going to enhance their own happiness just because that's how they are. And in pursuing those alternatives and pursuing those things that make them as happy as possible, people are able to assimilate enormous amounts of information and they're able to collect and adequately process information. They're able to logically sit down and compare the costs and the benefits through a marginal analysis and come up with the absolute best choice for themselves that's going to maximize their own well-being. Now, that's a pretty big assumption for most people. I don't know about you, but there are lots of times when I simply don't make the right decisions, at least in retrospect or in hindsight. There are things that I probably should have done, more information that I should have collected before I make a choice. Think about this. You've decided to come to this university and maybe that was the best choice, but it probably wasn't. There are so many other universities out there. There are hundreds of thousands of universities just in the United States. And finding the right one for you would take a lot of effort. It would require years probably of research, looking at the schools, looking at their placement rates for jobs, looking at the financial aid packages, trying to understand what it's like to live on campus and eat the food and experience campus life at all of these different places. If you want to make the absolute best, most rational decision, you need information on all of those things and all of these different places. And that's going to take a lot of time. That's going to take a lot of time away from things you could have been doing otherwise. In other words, it's going to incur a huge opportunity cost. Because you don't engage in that information gathering process, I think it's pretty safe to say that you've made a wrong choice. You weren't fully informed. In other words, you weren't acting as the Homo economicus. You weren't acting in the best interests of yourself because you didn't collect all of that information. Instead, you did something that was, well, what we call boundedly rational. It actually makes sense sometimes to just stop collecting information. And you're not going to make a fully informed decision, but you're going to save yourself a lot of headaches and a lot of opportunity costs by trying to become fully informed. You act boundedly rational. You say, look, there are limits to which I'm willing to go. There are things that once I hit this point, forget it. I'm not going any further in terms of collecting data. I'll make a choice. I'll make the best choice I have given the information that I have in front of me at that time. That's how most people actually operate. And it's a problem for the economic models, at least to an extent, because people, if they don't act rationally, they're not acting within the confines of the economic models. So, economists have been trying to deal with that problem. They've been trying to deal with it for some time now. And one of the ways we've come up with dealing with that problem is to approach analysis a little bit differently, to try to understand that people aren't always going to make the best, most informed decisions because it may not be in their interests in terms of opportunity costs to do so. So we've been trying to assimilate economic analysis with some psychology. And we've come up with a brand of economics called behavioral economics. Economics that involves economic thinking, but also psychological thinking. And trying to fuse those two ideas together. Again, we call it behavioral economics, because we're trying to understand the way people behave better using the tools of psychology. By doing this, it's allowed us to understand decisions that people make that at first blush might seem illogical or irrational. People don't always act logically. If you've ever watched Star Trek, you know what I'm talking about. There's that conflict between Kirk and Spock. Spock is supposed to be the logical one, and Kirk is the emotional one. And Spock he'll every so often raise an eyebrow and say, "That is not logical." And people don't always act logically. There are things that, again, kind of bind their rationality. Sometimes that occurs because information is imperfect. Imperfect information makes it impossible to make a fully informed decision. Another reason that people don't always make the most rational choices is because sometimes people are just they're just not capable of processing all that information. Their brains are limited. If you haven't yet run into someone smarter than you, just give it time. There is always something that we have just a problem processing. So it could be that you can't collect enough information, or that information is imperfect. It could be that that your brain's limited, and it could be that you just have a limited amount of time to make a decision. Let's take a look at a couple of pictures that reflect these problems that people face. Think about friends of yours, I'm sure just friends, who have been caught speeding. Sometimes you scratch your head and wonder, how in the world did they get caught? Well, one of the reasons we get caught speeding is because we don't have enough information about where the cops are sitting. This is where an app like Waze comes into play, where they can help you to identify where the speed traps are. But without that information, we end up getting pulled over on occasion. When information is imperfect, then we make decisions that don't always end up in our favor. Or if you're out at the bar with friends and you have too much to drink, it might impair the decisions that you're making. So, of course, that is something that's going to lead you to making irrational decisions. Sometimes we just don't have enough time to make a choice. Have you ever found yourself in one of these situations where it's like the 11th hour right before Christmas and you haven't found somebody a gift? And so you go out and you kind of buy something that's not the greatest. It's not even something that the person wants. You just had to get them something. You ran out of time. And when we have limited time to make decisions, sometimes we make really bad decisions. We certainly don't maximize anybody's happiness when those choices are made. This is one of the reasons, incidentally, why economists typically recommend that you just give people cash at Christmas time. And then finally, it might be that the person you're dealing with is just deranged. So Batman runs into the Joker on a regular basis, and he can't figure out what Joker's doing. He can't figure out what the next step is. Right now in this particular panel, Batman's furious because the Joker has done something crazy to Superman, and he just doesn't understand it. It doesn't seem rational to him. That's not how that game is played. And the problem, of course, is that Joker is insane. And so if you're dealing with someone who is certifiably crazy, sometimes the outcomes are not going to be rational. In fact, often the outcomes will not be rational. So that brings us to, how do we analyze people when they don't behave rationally? Or maybe rationally is a little bit strong there. Maybe we should be talking about how do we deal with people when their decision-making process is inconsistent? Is it entirely irrational if somebody makes a choice and then when the next time they're presented with the choice kind of runs contrary to the first choice that they made? Well, there are tools in psychology that help us to understand those decision-making processes. And sometimes those tools just seem weird. They seem odd. But let's explore a couple of the more basic ones so we can try to understand what drives people's decision-making, because it's the decisions that people make that help them to deal with scarcity. The first one of these inconsistencies in decision-making strategies is something that we call framing. Framing occurs when your response depends upon how the question is asked. One of the more puzzling results that comes as a result of framing involves organ donation. You are usually given the option, at least in the United States, of whether or not you want to be an organ donor. And if it's a good choice to make, it really shouldn't matter if you are given the choice to opt in to the organ donation process, which is, again, how it happens in the United States. Usually when you have your driver's license, you can check a box. Do you want to be an organ donor? It shouldn't matter if you opt in or opt out. In Europe, in most European countries, you actually have to opt out of being an organ donor, where you would check a box that says, I don't want to be an organ donor. But contrary to the logic, people who have to opt in are far less likely to be organ donors than people who have to opt out. That's a very puzzling thing, and it runs contrary to the notion that people would act rationally. If it's a good idea, it should be a good idea no matter how the question is posed. And that's the problem with framing. Another instance of framing that's really, really puzzling involves having your employer match your retirement contributions. We'll talk more about retirement and contributions to your retirement when we talk about personal finance. But many companies now will offer to match whatever you put in to your own retirement account. I remember when I had my first teaching job, I got a phone call from HR, and I didn't really know who they were or what they were talking about, but they were telling me that they could, if I were to take some money out of my paycheck and put it into a retirement plan, they would match it. Now, this sounded like a scam to me at the time, so I said, no, I don't want it, and I wasn't making very much money, so I certainly didn't want anybody taking more money out of my paycheck. But if I was told that I would have to opt out of that, basically if I was told, no, it's not an issue of you having to choose to have money taken out of your paycheck for retirement. The question is, do you want us to stop taking money out of your paycheck for retirement? And do you want us to stop matching that, basically giving you money for your retirement? I would have said, well, you people are crazy. Of course I don't want to opt out of that. But opting into it, I was very hesitant. It doesn't seem like that should be a rational decision, but people do these kinds of things all the time. The way the question is presented makes a huge difference in the outcomes. It doesn't seem like it should, but it does. That makes decisions sometimes very inconsistent. A second method by which we can analyze inconsistent decision making is something we call priming. The priming effect, or priming the pump, refers to how, when and how we answer questions depends upon the order the questions are asked, the order in which they are asked. So, for example, I might ask you, do you like your college major? Are you happy with the major you've chosen? And then follow that up with, do you expect to get a job? Now, the order of those two questions doesn't seem like that's all too odd or strange, but depending upon how I order those questions, I can get very different responses. If I ask you first, how do you like your college major? You're probably going to say yes, otherwise you wouldn't have chosen it. And then if I follow that up with, hey, do you think you're going to get a job? Your answer will also probably be yes, because you like your major, you like the classes that you're taking, you think you're learning something. But if I flip the questions and ask you, do you think you're going to get a job? Well, in this economy, the answer may be no. And then if I ask you after that, well, do you like your college major? People are more likely to say no to the question of, do you like your college major, if they think they're not going to get a job. But if I change the order back, I'm more likely to get people to say yes. I get different responses depending upon how I prime the question. If I'm really interested in knowing, do you think you're going to get a job? and I precede it with a question about your college major, I can actually get different responses. Sometimes we see these effects in polling as well, in political polls. Priming can lead us to different answers, and if people are rational, that should not be the case. A third way of looking at inconsistency in decision making is something called status quo bias. You've probably seen this guy on TV if you've ever turned a TV on. The Geico Gecko is constantly trying to get you to switch your car insurance to Geico, or your homeowner's insurance, or your motorcycle insurance, or your RV insurance. For insurance companies, they can compete pretty viciously on price. But what they have to overcome is this idea of a status quo bias, the idea that we want to keep things the same even though there's a better proposition for us out there. And this happens all the time with insurance. You have an insurance company and you think it's the best, you think it's good, you're comfortable with them, but you could do better somewhere. And so Geico and Progressive and State Farm and name any insurance company, they're all trying to convince you to switch to them, to overcome the proclivity that people have to just stick with something, stick with the status quo, even though there's a better option. This has been one of the things I've been dealing with lately. For a couple of years, I had a mortgage, and then interest rates started to go down. And so I thought, maybe I ought to see about changing to a lower interest rate mortgage. Now, that whole process of refinancing a home is kind of a cumbersome one. It's kind of a pain in the neck. In part, I think it's to keep people locked in to the status quo. But if you're willing to try to overcome that status quo bias, you can save thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars by refinancing a mortgage. You may have to leave the bank you currently are with and go somewhere else to do that. And banks are counting on you being locked into the status quo to say to yourself, it's too much trouble. There's probably something better out there, but why would I do that? Currently, I'm on my third refinance because rates have continued to drop, and I've learned enough about the status quo bias that I want to get past that. I want to overcome that status quo bias so that I can take advantage of these great interest rates. But not everybody's willing to do that. Another instance of the status quo bias is something that a friend of mine from California likes to talk about with great regularity, and that has to do with relationships. Sometimes we get ourselves into relationships where our friends tell us, you could do better. But once we get into a relationship and we get comfortable with that relationship, sometimes we can fall prey to the status quo bias, where we say, there's probably somebody better out there for me, but, switching is expensive. Switching is kind of a pain in the neck. Switching to somebody else that may or may not be better in the long run, I don't want to do that. I'll just stick with what I have. It's a status quo bias, and we fall prey to it, even though we shouldn't fall prey to it, especially on the financial side. If there are things that can make us better off financially, and we don't take advantage of them, that seems utterly irrational. But people do it all the time. They fall prey to the status quo bias. The last area I want to talk about in terms of these things that interfere with people's decision making and lead them to making what seem like irrational decisions is something we call intertemporal decision making, or more generally, the idea of time preference. We don't usually associate pirates with economics. I mean, other than the fact that pirates are trying to steal from other people, and maybe there's some economics involved there. But pirates and economics actually have a lot that would bring them together. There's a really interesting book called The Invisible Hook about economics and pirating. One of the things that involves pirates and economics is that pirates sometimes seem to make bad decisions. But really what they're doing is they're making decisions under the context of time preference, or looking at the intertemporal decisions that could be made. When we're talking about intertemporal decision making, we're talking about something very specific. We're asking the question, can you value the present and the future consistently? Can you value the present and the future consistently? There's lots of questions that we face in life around this idea of valuing the present and the future consistently. One of the interesting ones that I've seen involves retirement, and specifically saving for retirement. Any financial advisor that you talk to will tell you it's better to start saving early for retirement. If you start earlier, it will allow you to compound interest over time, and it will allow you to actually save less and have more when it's time to retire. Again, we'll talk about that particular situation and how that all plays out when we talk about personal finance. And even though almost everybody understands it's better to start saving early, and all of the advice is to start saving early, people still don't do it. They don't do it because they think, well, I don't have enough to save right now, or just if I save $5 a month, that doesn't make a difference. Or they're lazy, or there's something that prohibits us from valuing the present and the future in the same kind of way. And if we did, we would save more for the present. We would save more in the present, so we would have more in the future, but we don't. That's a clear illustration of us having problems with intertemporal decision making. There's been some really interesting studies trying to evaluate intertemporal decision making and the impact it might have on you over time. There's a very famous study where a bunch of kids were given were basically brought into a psychological study, and they were told if they we're going to put you in a room and we're going to put a marshmallow in front of you, and if you don't eat that marshmallow after 10 minutes, we'll give you a second marshmallow. And some of the kids were able to hold out, some of them weren't. But what was interesting about the study was that those children were followed for the next 20 or 30 years to see just what happened to them. And one of the things that connected the successful children, the ones who had better jobs, better grades, went to better colleges, were the people who were able to forego the marshmallow in the present, to basically say, I will wait and have more, who had a different time preference than other people. Now, when we talk about time preferences, there are two different kinds of time preferences. The first is what we call a high time preference. A high time preference, or sometimes this is referred to as a strong time preference, are people who value the present over the future. They value the things they can get today. And maybe you've seen this, and maybe you've been this person in the past, where as soon as you get money in your pocket, so here you are walking along, you find some money on the street, and you're like, oh, this is great, I'm going to take this money, and you immediately go into the first store that you see, and you spend that money, and you walk out with something that is, it's like okay, but it's not the greatest. People who have high time preferences or strong time preferences value the immediate gratification. They value getting something right now as opposed to waiting for it. Whereas people who have a low or a weak time preference these are people who value the future over the present. These are people who find that money on the street, and instead of taking it into a store, they take that money right into the bank. And they say, hey, I found this money on the street. I want to put it in my account because I don't want to spend it right now. I might want to spend it later. So given these two different types of time preference, high time preference and low time preference, or weak strong time preference and weak time preference, where do you think pirates fall in? What's the connection between time preference and pirates? Well, it turns out that pirates are typically pretty desperate people. It's one of the reasons why they get into piracy in the first place. And so they're willing to take a lot of risks because they don't know what tomorrow is going to bring. For a lot of them, tomorrow might bring jail, it might bring death, it's going to likely bring something bad. And so they end up having a very high time preference. Anytime they loot a ship, they go out and spend the money. They're not saving for the future. Similar circumstances happen in countries where there's war. One of the interesting little tidbits in the Harry Potter book and the Harry Potter series talks about time preference, although they don't specify it as time preference. If you remember, there's this wedding that's about to happen. And later in the books, one of Ron Weasley's brothers is getting married. And Ron's mom is kind of like, I don't know, the kids are rushing into this. They're not thinking it through. And the answer is, hey, who knows what's going to happen tomorrow? We're about to start a war with the most evil wizard of all time. We may not get a chance to get married. Let's do it right now. And by the way, Mom, isn't this the way you and Dad were the last time he who should not be named was in power? People who have a dim view of the future, not sure what the future is going to hold, they make decisions that are going to have an immediate impact. They have a very high time preference. So there are two other areas I want to spend just a little bit of time talking about. These are going to move us into a way of analyzing individual decision making called game theory. But before we get into the intricacies of game theory, let me present to you one of the most renowned games in all of game theory, because it helps to understand, it helps to explain why some people make choices that are not necessarily in their own best interest. It's a game called the ultimatum game. One of the ways we can examine behavior through game theory is to use what we call a game theoretic tree. The game tree is just a way of basically illustrating how players and payoffs work. So what we're going to do is we're going to start our tree right here. Anytime you see a circle, somebody has to make a choice. And so in this game, we're just going to call this person player one. Ready, player one. You have to make a decision about how to allocate money. You have two choices. You can allocate it fairly, or you can allocate it in a way that would be viewed as unfair. At the end of each of those branches of the tree, somebody else has to make a choice. And in this case, it's going to be player two. So player two is now going to act. Player one makes an offer, either fair or unfair. And player two has to decide whether they are going to accept the proposal or reject the proposal. That's what happens at the end of each one of these branches. So player one makes a fair offer, player two accepts it or rejects it. Player one makes an unfair offer, and player two either accepts it or rejects it. What the ultimatum game tells us or shows us is that sometimes people view fairness as so important that they're willing to harm themselves to make the point that fairness is so important. At the end of each one of these branches of the game tree, I'm going to put a set of potential payoffs. So let's say that player one has to decide how to split $500. Player one decides, I'm going to split this money in a way that is going to either be looked at as fair or unfair. Now, the catch here is that player 1 only gets to keep any of the money if player 2 accepts the proposal, if they accept the split. Let's say we have a fair offer and player 2 accepts that. What we might be looking at is a payoff of, say, 250 and 250. In other words, player 1 says, hey, player 2, I'm going to split the money evenly with you. And if that is done in the ultimatum game, it is almost universally accepted. Now, sometimes you might have an offer where player 2 makes a fair proposal and player 1 makes a fair proposal and player 2 rejects it. And if that's the case, both players get 0. Now, that is almost never seen, but it does happen sometimes. Now, if player 1 makes an unfair offer and player 2 rejects it, we could sort of see the logic there. Hey, that was unfair. I don't appreciate what you've done here to me, so I'm going to reject the offer. But that in and of itself would be illogical. Because by rejecting the offer, no matter how unfair it is, that means player 2 gets 0 as opposed to something. The economic answer to this puzzle, the outcome that an economist would expect to see, is this one right here, where player 1 makes a proposal and they keep $499 and they offer $1 to player 2. That's what an economist would do and would expect to have happen, because player 2, even though they only get $1, it's still better than 0. But this is almost always rejected in the ultimatum game. In fact, there are lots of what are viewed to be as unfair payoffs where the player 2 gets much more than $1, but those offers are rejected. And the reason they're rejected, at least the conclusion of the ultimatum game, is that maybe people don't make decisions purely on their own best interests. Maybe part of what we should be considering is that fairness is part of the equation. And if somebody feels like they're getting a raw deal, even if the deal is beneficial to them, they may reject the deal. The reality is that fairness does matter. That's one of the things we see in games like the ultimatum game and things that like behavioral economics can teach us, that people don't always make the decisions that we think they will make because there are other factors that influence not only the choices that we make, but the deals that we accept. All right, I've got one last thing, and it involves a word that I mentioned just kind of in passing a little bit ago, the idea of risk. Risk affects the decisions that people make. In fact, risk affects those decisions quite significantly. Sometimes people are willing to take a bet or make a bet or make a choice that other people would find incredibly risky because of their personality. So let's take a look at risk through the context of, I think, one of the dumbest game shows of all time.
189,000. Walked away from the house.
But I want a big house for my mom.
Open the case. Will you marry me? Everybody, via satellite. All the way from South Africa. This is a game, but this is a life-changing game. Deal or no deal?
Yes, deal or no deal. What a stupid game. It's just a bunch of people screaming and yelling and pointing at numbers and guessing. That's all it is a big guessing game. Although there is something interesting about the guessing. There is actually something of some intellectual value in that game. I remember the first time I watched this game show, and it was the first or second time I'd been on TV, and someone was being made an offer, and I calculated the offer, at least pretty close, and my wife was like, "What did you just do?" I said, "Well, this is clearly a game about what we call expected value." And she said, "No, no, no. You've just ruined the game is what you've done." Let me give you an illustration of how deal or no deal works. And then we're going to talk a little bit about risk and risk-taking behavior. All right, so to try to understand risk-taking and behavior, I've brought in a sidekick. This is my daughter, Kate. She's here to help us out to understand risk-taking behavior. And so all she needs to do is to make a couple of pretty basic decisions. The first decision she needs to make is to pick one of these 3 eggs. In each one of these eggs is a certain amount of money. And if we were doing this in class, this would be your extra credit money, but we're not, so this is money for Kate. One egg has $1 in it, one egg has $100 in it, and one egg has $1,000 in it. So, Kate, you got your 3 choices here. Go ahead and pick a winner.
I'll take yellow.
Okay, so you get the yellow egg. Now, before we start to see what's in the eggs, I'm going to make an offer to Kate. I'm going to make the offer of the mythical $367 bill. With, of course, James K. Polk, our 11th president, on the face of the $367 bill. So, Kate, would you take $367, or would you want to see what's in the egg? Now, you at home, playing at home, may want to start yelling at the screen right now to say, cheer her on and to make one decision or another. Say, take the money, or no, don't take the money, and let's see what's in the egg. So maybe you're doing that at home right now, and I can sort of hear somebody's doing it. Katie, what do you think? Are you going to take this $367, or are you going to wait and see what's in your egg?
I'll wait and see what's in the egg.
Okay, so we're taking this $367, we're putting it in the can, and now we're going to open an egg. Now, Katie knows she's got the yellow egg. She doesn't know what's in it. But I'm going to see what is in the green egg and see if Katie has maybe made the wrong decision or the right decision. Ooh. In the green egg is $100. She doesn't get the $100, which means in her egg is either $1 or $1,000. Now, I'm going to make you another offer. I'm going to make you an offer of $50. So you can either take $50, walk away here with $50 in your hand, or you could see if you have the $1,000 in your egg. What are you going to do?
I'll keep the egg.
You'll keep the egg? So you're going to basically chuck the $50 and you're going to see what's in the egg.
Yeah.
All right. So why don't you open your egg? I could open this one instead. But Katie, why don't you open your egg and show us what is in that egg?
Oh, dang.
Oh, dang. She ended up with $1. Wah, wah. So sad.
So very sad.
But Katie made one really good decision in this whole process. She had no idea what was in any of the eggs. The eggs are totally random. When she rejected that $50, that was the right choice. When she rejected the original $367, that might have been the wrong choice. To understand that, we have to understand something more about expected value. So let's go back to the class and see if we can calculate expected value and understand why Katie made the choices that she made and why actually, all of them could have been the right choice. It just depends on her risk preference. When we bring risk into decision making, there are three categories that we focus on. One is the person who we call risk averse. The risk averse person is someone who doesn't like risk. They will take a sure thing as opposed to any potential expected value. The risk averse person takes the sure thing, no matter how large the expected value of a bet. To put this in perspective, the risk averse person is someone who goes onto the game show Deal or No Deal, and the first time a deal is offered to them, they take it. They say, give me the money. I want the sure thing right now. These are not the kind of people the producers of Deal or No Deal want on the show, because they are not very interesting. They don't take risks. Instead, the producers of Deal or No Deal want one of these other two types of people on the show. They might be okay with someone we call risk neutral. A risk neutral person is someone who would be indifferent between a bet and the expected value. So, assuming they can calculate the expected value, they would be okay taking that expected value. The risk neutral person is kind of like on the peak of a roof, and they could go either way. If they know what the expected value of a bet is, then if the money that's offered to them is more than the expected value, they'll take it. If the money is less than the expected value, they'll take the bet. But if the money is exactly the same as the expected value, they don't care. They need to flip a coin, basically. The risk-averse person takes the money no matter whether it's higher than the expected value or lower than the expected value. They take the money, they don't want the risk. And these people might be okay on Deal or No Deal, but what the producers really, really want is our third contestant, the third type of person. They are what we call the risk-loving individual. The person who is risk-loving will take a bet over any sure thing. So the risk-loving person is going to take the bet no matter how big the sure thing is. Now, there might be a risk-loving person who says, look, as long as the expected value is larger than the bet, I'm going to continue to take the bet. And sometimes the risk-loving person will take the bet even if the expected value is smaller than the sure thing. The risk-loving person just loves to take a risk, and this is what you want on a show like Deal or No Deal, where the show is basically a guessing game and people act like idiots on stage. So, we've got our risk-averse people, the risk-neutral people, and the risk-loving people. So to calculate the expected value, what we do is we take the probability of an event, we'll just call that probability 1, and multiply it by whatever the payoff for that event is. And then we add it to the probability of the second event times the payoff of that second event. And we do that for as many events as we have. So if we have probability 3 times payoff 3, all the way until whatever our nth event is. So if we have 20 events, then n would equal 20. And that's how we get the expected value. So it's a pretty basic calculation. Now, based on the exercise that we just observed, we know what the probabilities are and we know what the payoffs are. Therefore, we can calculate the expected value. We know that there is a 1/3 chance that Kate's going to pick $1. We know there's a 1/3 chance that she's going to pick $100. And we know there's a 1/3 chance that she's going to pick $1,000. So if we take those probabilities and multiply them by the payoffs, we calculate the expected value. So that would be 0.33 plus 33.33 plus 333.33, which equals 367. Go figure. That is the expected value of this game. Now, if I start to make some offers that are of any amount, we can determine whether or not Katie was risk averse, risk neutral, or risk loving. All right, think about the deals that I made. The first deal I offered her was $367. The expected value of the game. If Katie was risk neutral, she would have taken that. That's right there, the equivalent of the expected value. Now, she would have also taken this if she was risk averse, because it's a sure thing. But she certainly would not have taken this if she was risk loving. No way she takes this. The chance of getting $1,000 is still out there. There's still the possibility that she could earn more money. But if she's risk neutral, you take this. If you're risk averse, you take this. Now, the second deal I offered her was for $50, which seems kind of cheesy and kind of not very good, because we know what the expected value was at that point, and we can compare it to the $50. We know that what she has left is either $1 or $1,000. So if we calculate the expected value of that, we have 50 cents plus $500, which is $500.50. That's the expected value. Not even the risk neutral person would take this. But if she's risk averse, she would. The risk averse person, and maybe you change your appreciation of risk, but the risk averse person says, give me that $50. The risk neutral person says, you know what, the expected value of this bet is higher than $50. I'll take the bet. And certainly the risk loving person is still standing there. I got a chance at $1,000. So depending upon the risk preference, in fact, let's look at one last comparison here. At the very beginning of this exercise, the risk-averse person is the only person who's going to take $50. They take $50, it's a sure thing. The risk-neutral person, they would only take $367 if that's the offer. Of course, they would take something higher, but they're not going to take anything lower than $367. And the risk-loving person, They may not take any deal, as they may take nothing less than $1,000, and they may not even take that just because they like the idea of the bet. The point is that risk affects the decisions that we make. And if we ignore risk, if we look at a group of people and say, oh, risk doesn't matter, we might see them making choices that at first blush don't make sense. Think about COVID. Think about people getting together and having COVID parties and basically eschewing the recommendations of government officials and health experts. We can say that those people have some degree of risk that they're willing to accept. That changes the decisions that they make. Very clearly it changes them. Risk comes into play, like so many other things that we've talked about today come into play. So that's a little bit about behavioral economics. What I want to do next time we get together is to explore something that I've referred to already in our time together, and that's game theory. And try to understand how game theory might lead us to outcomes that are utterly bizarre and almost unthinkable, but examined through the prism of game theory make imminent sense.